The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
I just read chapter 5 for the first time in several years. And I was impressed with all the good quotes, but I was wondering if anything I said was up to anything those people said. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. What else did Anais Nin write? I don't know who she is, actually. Anyone know this writer? What else does she do?
She wrote Diaries of Her Time in Paris.
Is it good?
Yes.
I don't know where.
Sexually explicit.
And the second half of the chapter is about this wonderful project that really ran for several years, in which we tried to build robots that could see and manipulate things. And all sorts of wonderful things appeared in that year. For example, one of the goal of the robot project was a very simple one. We decided that the robot would live in a world of mostly rectangular blocks, and a very simple job that a 2-year-old cannot do, but a 4 or 5-year-old has no trouble with, would be taking some particular structure. I should have brought some blocks. These are blocks, but they're not going to work. I can. Two of these are flat on the top, so. I doubt if our robot could have built that. I didn't know about rolling. But the idea is you would build something out of these blocks, little house or more complicated structure, and our one-armed robot would try to duplicate it. And in order to do that, it had to be able to look at the scene and figure out what the scene was made of and what were the relation of the blocks and which blocks they were. And it had a big pile of them. So it had to make a plan for what it was going to do. In the very first minute of the project, Jerry Sussman wrote, we had obtained this robot and gotten the computer to control it. And Jerry Sussman wrote a program, and immediately to build an arch, and immediately it started with this block first and put it here. And in fact, Sussman's PhD thesis was a profound piece of work discussing various classes of bugs, beginning with these kind of simple ones where you do things in the wrong order. And as far as I know, there's no PhD thesis quite like it. Do you know anything, Henry, that's I mean, a lot of theses are about bugs in things and fixing them. But if you're looking for something to write about, you can go all the way back to 1970 and look at a couple of those theses. And generally, they were very ambitious. There's a whole group of them I'll discuss at some point. So you shouldn't, if you're trying to copy a structure, you have to analyze what is supporting what, and there's no point in trying to place something until its supports are in place. But how do you look at the scene and see things? And at one point in the project, there was a remarkable thing. I think it was Manuel Bloom who did this particular one, but he discovered that if you looked at the outline of a big mess of blocks, there was a good chance that by following a wonderful set of rules that he made, you could figure out what was going on. This is a great feature of working in a restricted world where the computer can know all of the objects in that world that could exist. And so you can see the process, but he wrote this program that just looks at this outline, and then it's, where did I put the death ray? Here it is. Couldn't see it because it was supported by a napkin. So it just looks at that and says, well, none of the blocks have an interior angle, so this can't be true, and those can't be true. So what do I do about that? And you see, I could extend that line either up or this line out. Maybe it does both, I've forgotten, but it does this, and it extends this one, and presumably it tries 4 or 8 different combinations until it finds 2 that make a little more sense. So then it draws in these, and once it's drawn in those 2, see, then it can conjecture that maybe this is a block, and if so, you see, then it has to put in those 2 edges, and that works out fine. And then here's the 6-sided thing, and there are no hexagons in the blocks world, so it says this cannot be, and what could it be? And the answer is it could be that, and so forth. So we were quite astounded that you could do that well, but of course it's always a surprise. Maybe this is why mathematics works. If you look at something like group theory, here you have a little system which has 5 logical axioms, and I guess Galois is the first person to study systems that had those 5 simple axioms. And every day, to this day, mathematicians around the world discover 10 or 100 new things about the consequences of what happens in that tiny world where there are objects, there's an identity object, you multiply things, they may or may not commute, that's 2 different kinds of groups, but they all obey the associative law, and so this is sort of an example of where a mathematician has invented a little system that describes almost everything that can happen in this tiny world. Well, of course, the world of common sense is much larger, and people like Henry Lieberman and several others around the world are trying to, I don't know if formalize is the right word, because if you're trying to find 1 million axioms for a particular universe, then that's not you can't hope that that will end up like mathematics.
Marvin, how about the word informalized?
Informalized. Right. Of course, we all hope that someday all of the, not many groups that are working on collecting and characterizing common sense knowledge will be able to more or less get them to all work together and start to have something that has the abilities of a 4 or 5-year-old. If you can get there, then you can get it to have all the if you can get a machine that will learn enough, then it will keep getting smarter. And there's no reason to think it will flatten out the way people do. We don't know if people would flatten out. No one knows what would happen if somebody kept thinking for 500 years. You see all of these expensive government projects, but you wonder why there isn't one to. Well, I don't know what to say about this chapter because it has so many strange and interesting things in it. So, it ends with a very cryptic discussion of how do you make a machine that will watch things happen for a long time and then start to predict what will come after that. And the answer is you have to develop stories and scripts and beautiful ways to summarize your experience and then find ways to fit them together. If you're writing a story, then you're not doing that sort of thing, but you're making a little world and you're inventing events in the past and future of each character and trying to get something that looks more or less lifelike to people. Anyway, there's so many things in this that I don't see any point in trying to summarize them all, except to hope you have some questions and things to discuss. Yes?
So, how well do we actually need to understand intelligence in order to create a replica of it as an artificial intelligence that can fool, say, 99% of the world? So as an analogy, like let's say you have an art forger. To truly create something that will fool 100% of the world, they would have to know the exact brush strokes and what paints and oils that the person used, the original artist. But if you just want to fool 99%, you don't need to know that much. So how much do we need to know about intelligence to actually create something that people will see as intelligent?
I'm not sure what you mean by fool, because if you have a program that solves hard problems, what would it mean to say, it's just executing instructions, it's not really thinking?
So I guess as a better definition of fool, so something like the Turing test where you say, oh, there's a person. So how much we would have to know about intelligence to say, if we could just put them in another room, give them some sort of telephone, if we could just run the Turing test and fool 99% of the people that are testing?
Not a test for intelligence. It's a test for when will people think it's intelligent. I mean, I'm not sure. Suppose that you didn't know that there were foreign languages, and you came across a Norwegian, and you couldn't understand anything it said. You would say, what is the use of this ridiculous machine that just makes stupid sounds? So I think people have always wanted to measure things, and the IQ test, Binet and Simon. What Simon? That wasn't Herb Simon. I'm trying to remember which Simon that was. That became a useful tool for seeing, measuring things that children could do and deciding whether there seemed to be something wrong with the child's development or whether it's getting too smart for its. I don't know if anybody got concerned when somebody got high IQs, but.
Well, if I could ask a different question then. How much do we have to know about intelligence in order to create something that can create something smarter than itself?
Well, everyone creates something smarter than oneself in their childhood, so that doesn't seem very. I'm not sure how hard that is. I wonder what is the right question to ask? How do you judge the progress of artificial intelligence? That might be a good question. As I see it, it took a dive in recent years, but not. I think I've complained about it too much, but what happened is that when we started this kind of work, it was a sort of golden age for science, because I've said it before, because at the end of World War II, there was a lot of machinery around. Maybe it's almost a joke, but there were 1 million kids who could get their hands on war surplus electronics. Now, of course, everybody can get their hand on a little computer or something, or cell phone or whatever. But what's difficult is getting a job to work on. Suppose you wanted to work for 5 years on some aspect of artificial intelligence. The machines aren't smart enough, you think. They don't have enough common sense knowledge, or they don't use it right, or whatever, and you'd like to really work on that problem. And there are lots of reasons. I think I showed you a set of slides that showed a lot of reasons to work on what are the problems that civilization is facing. This morning I turned on WBUR, and some people were complaining for a whole hour that there's no way the United States can support older people who have infirmities, either mental or physical, because there's not enough money to hire the nurses, or there are not enough nurses to take care of them. My bet is that instead of spending $1 trillion on Medicare, which is one option, but then almost everybody will be working to support these the infirmities of these older people. It'll be a very strange civilization if you spend all of the resources you need. So why not say what we need is AI to help these people? And if the AI is smarter than a regular person, then it's not even demeaning. So I'd like to see a very small budget, like $1 billion, that has the goal of making intelligent machines in 20 years, which means that you could hire 100,000 smart young people to spend 10 or 20 years working on this sort of thing. It'd be terribly cheap. Nobody's in charge, though. And you can't buy long-term care insurance, in a sense, because there'll be nobody to provide it. I'm rambling, but you see that it is potentially it's a very important field, but it's not in the politicians' spectrum of things you could do to have a better future for less money. I doubt if there's a single congressman who even knows that this is a plausible gamble. Anybody know a politician who understands an issue like that? Now, is there a question I can answer? I feel I should get Winston to say something. Have you discussed this with students? How many students do you have who would like to be a professor? And what are they doing? Pat was one of a few students who wanted to be a professor. We're talking the late 1960s. And it turned out to be possible. But it's very hard now.
Well, I decided I'd leave as soon as I found work.
I told you, when Sussman was a freshman, he said, I like this, I'm going to stay forever. But did you ever find work?
No. Of course, I never looked either. So.
I had this bizarre experience. When I was a senior, because I thought I might have to find work. And I ran into somebody called Edmund C. Berkeley, who had written a book about robots. So to speak. He had edited a popular electronics magazine, and so I went to see him. He was actually working at the Prudential Life. Did I tell this story? Because he had written this book on brainiacs or something, Geniac. It was a little machine with 3 wheels of cardboard and some wires, and you could put in little contacts and switches and get it to compute Boolean functions. So it really was this is a 1948 computer. Didn't do much, but it did it. I had a little book to go with it, so I went to visit him, and he said, well, I don't really know anything more about this than I described in that toy, but I have a young friend named Martin Gardner who has built some other kind of logic machine, and he lives in Brooklyn. So I went to see this Martin Gardner, and I'm sure you all know who he was, but he wasn't on the, he had just finished a thesis called, or a paper called Order and Surprise. And for me, it was the best thing I had ever read since Bertrand Russell or Aristotle. Namely, he said, suppose that an alien came down and looked at the world and he discovered this huge green thing with 1 billion grains of grass. They're all pointed almost the same way, and they're all about the same height. And this alien said, what's the probability that such a thing could happen? Could it be an accident? Well, no, then the probability of 1 blade of grass would be 0.000 something, and the probability of 2 of them would be that squared, and the probability of 1 billion of them would be 2 to the billion, 2 to the 1,000 billion, or I can't calculate anything like that. Anyway, Gardner convinced me, I think, that I should just keep doing what I was doing, namely figure out how to build learning machines and see if I could make them get smarter and smarter. But it's a great digression. But the same thing happened to me at least a dozen times of just somehow running into the right people at the right time. And I hope that happens to you. I don't know how you, what's the trick, Ed?
have to recognize them somehow.
Fredkin is an old friend of mine from the 1970s,
From the 1950s.
50s, whatever it was. And he was always in the right place at the right time. In fact, he was director of Project Mac for a while, of what became the Laboratory of Computer Science. Only he did such a good job that some of the faculty was jealous. End of story. It's a bad story. So you have to look for them. If you like somebody's work, just go and see them. However, don't ask for their autograph. A lot of people come and ask me for my autograph, and it's creepy. What I did was read everything they'd published first and correct them. That's what they really want. Every smart person wants to be corrected, not admired. Back to reality. So I don't know whether one, it seems to me you don't want a Turing test. We all know that if we could make a machine that behaved a lot like a 4-year-old, then we could make it better and it would start behaving like a 5-year-old, and eventually it would be smarter than us. And this Turing test thing is a joke. And Turing regarded it as a joke. If you read his paper carefully, he's saying, I'm not deciding whether a machine is intelligent. I'm only deciding what performance would be such that a person would be really impressed, whether it deserved to be applauded or not. And now in the case of IQ test, you could say the same thing, except that generally people who are good at 10 different things, or much better at 10 different things than most other people, are good candidates for solving a new problem they haven't seen before. So it's not useless, but what's annoying is when people think that Turing was saying this is a test for whether a machine's an intelligent. Yes?
So I want to argue that representation is like really important for intelligence. So for example, if you have a SAT sentence,
If you have what?
a SAT sentence like X1 or X2 and X3 or X4, like
A question with several answers proposed.
like you want to know if that's satisfiable or not. Like it's important to know, for example, if that sentence is important or not, if it's solvable or not, if there is a solution that transforms that sentence true or false. But you can just say that, oh, there is a solution that this is true, this sentence is true. And I'm just transforming from one representation to another. So, like, at the beginning, I have a representation, which is a sentence. At the end, like this sentence X1 or X2 and X3 or X4. And at the end, I have just, oh, this is satisfiable or not. But they are just representations of the same thing. And, like, for example, there are some theories about, like, for example, Shannon. He just states, like, what's the optimal representation according to the length of, like, the word. But maybe that's not the most important thing. Maybe there is some trade-off about, like, how big is, like, the sentence and, like, how easy I can get to another representation of that sentence or that thing. Like, it seems that we humans are very good at representing stuff and switching between representations, but we don't have a very a good sense of what's a good representation in that sense, that I can change between, I don't know, solutions, or I can change between representations of the same thing. And maybe an intelligent machine is a machine that can represent things in a good way and can switch very well.
Well, you're asking, I think he's asking a deep question, which is, how many of you know Shannon's theory of information? Almost everyone. That is, if you have a set of things, how many binary choices does it, or questions would you have to answer to find a particular one? That's log n. But if you don't know the probability, if they have different probabilities, then you need a more complicated formula, which is the sum of the inverse log probabilities, blah, blah, blah. And that's a beautiful theory. Now, that works perfectly for well-defined situations, for example, where you have some enormous set of messages that you can describe as with set theory in a neat way, with probabilities, and you want to know how long it will take to transmit information about, to pick one of that large set on a particular physical channel. And Shannon discovered this wonderful formula, which turned out to be the same as the formula for entropy in physics. And I have a long story, or short story about that, which is that thousands of papers were published about this new theory of Shannon's, which came out in 1950, I think, and maybe 48. And then suddenly they stopped, because in some sense, all of the important questions about that theory had been answered by the middle 1970s. So that's less than 25 years. Anyway, a lot of people said, but this theory only works for very well-defined mathematical situations where there are signals and probabilities and symbols and so forth. Is there anything that is there a similar theory that could describe machines? Like, suppose you take an automobile and it's got a lot of gears and pistons and spark plugs and electric gadgets, and it's not enough to describe that as a list of parts. You have to say something about what each part does, the shapes of parts and how they fit together, and so forth. And so shortly after Shannon's theory became popular, lots of people said, well, is there a similar theory for structural information? Is there a theory like that for geometric forms and for mechanical things and for chemical reactions and so forth? And no one ever found, in other words, is there a theory of what you might call semantic information rather than just statistical information? And as far as I know, there isn't any. There still might be, but it's the only case I know where a whole scientific field appeared and then stopped. You look at everything else and it keeps going. And in fact, we had a journal of information theory and the editorial board was mostly MIT professors. And this journal was published for about 10 years. And then one day we were picking the papers for the next issue. And everyone rejected all of their papers on this committee. And the journal, we declared the journal finished. I don't know. What journals have closed lately? There must be some, but they don't get much attention. Will the Wall Street Journal close?
Are all the important questions about Wall Street answered?
There are a lot of people camped out on their sidewalk. I don't know if what's bothering you?
Marvin, could you just say a little bit more about what you mean by semantic information theory? Because that's bothering me at the moment.
I don't know what I mean. I guess the point is that if you look at the objects in Shannon's theory, they're just little points in some abstract space, and they each have a probability, and that's all there is to them. And if you say there's 1 million gadgets in your catalog and each one has a certain probability, and you don't know anything else about them, then suppose you want to make a big sequence of them and transmit to someone else how to reconstruct that sequence. Well, if you just took the first one and the second one, and wrote a sequence which goes A, B, A, B, A, B 1 million times, then you could compress that by somehow communicating a description of what you mean by repeating a sequence, and then say, now repeat the sequence AB 1 million times. And you can presumably describe 1 million in some ways also. And the whole mess. Once you've sent those descriptions, then the further such messages of that kind would be very short. But now if you go and take random samples of these 1 million things, then if they're all equal probability, then it's going to take 20 bits for each to tell about each symbol, and there's nothing you can do to reduce that bandwidth. So semantic information would be somehow transmitting other commonsensical or informal information about the objects you're talking about, rather than just their probabilities of the individual items. Whatever it is, nobody ever found. Everybody said we want semantic information theory, and no one could say what they meant by it. If you had a good definition, maybe one of us can do it.
Yeah, well, let me try. I mean, isn't that the kind of thing that we do in a lot of knowledge representation, as if you make an ontology in advance, and we have a common ontology, then I just need to index those concepts in the ontology, or if you have concept matter, or if you have open line, where you have a default body of common sense knowledge, or some default body of semantics, then yes, you can communicate semantic message. You can communicate a lot of semantics in very short messages.
Well, for example, generally the most useful words in the language are the short ones. So, but I don't see how you could get such a neat theory as Shannon's. But it's like group theory or something where arithmetic is much harder than group theory, because in arithmetic you have a situation where there's two different groups. There's on the integers where you're multiplying things and you're adding things, and number theory is immensely complicated, and group theory is, well, it can get complicated, but Generally, it's a very clear field where I don't know what to say. Very likely, out of the attempts to build common sense systems will come some beautiful theories at some point. You might almost have them now. I was trying to read some of the people from your group, and the papers are pretty hard to read. So they look very good, but I wish I could get them down to one page and understand it.
You have to have intuition for tensors.
Tensors. Things with a lot of subscripts. So what do you think the AI people should do next?
I think I'm going to harp on the Turing test still. If we were able to demonstrate, if a machine were able to demonstrate the kind of common sense reasoning that a 4-year-old does by building that arch, is that analogous to the imitation game that Turing was trying to propose? Because in the paper he does say with improved performance, memory, and program that the machine will have. So if it were able to imitate the behavior, is it a reflection of what was involved in getting to that point to imitate? It's just, I mean, deception is one part. I think there are a lot of objections he addresses, but so in our example, if a machine actually demonstrated the common sense of a 4-year-old, wouldn't that be an analog to imitation?
We once had a Turing test situation where in the early days we had teletypes attached to a big computer in Technology Square, and it was all connected on one of the first beautiful time-sharing systems. And one of the engineers who worked on the time-sharing system was a young professor named Herb Teeger. And I fooled him for a minute into thinking that I had an AI program, but I was actually in another room, and he would
reverse
type
Turing
questions
test.
and I would answer them in a very stilted computer-like fashion. And then he said, "How much is this times that?" And he had two 15-digit numbers, which he must have just typed like this. So I very cleverly replied, "Accumulator overflow." But I misspelled accumulator. So I failed the Turing test. Do you remember Teeger? Ed Fredkin here is one of the 3 or 4 inventors of large-scale time-sharing computers. Any good stories about that?
Yeah, there are lots of good stories from long ago, but I don't know if people would be interested.
Just one.
I'll just say one thing. Long ago, when I met Marvin and John McCarthy, who was also a professor at MIT at the time, was very mysterious to me. John McCarthy was a professor of electrical engineering, and Marvin was in the math department, if I remember right. And I had this idea of maybe, the universe is a computer in some sense, and physics would then be some kind of discrete space-time state process. And I broached that idea to both John McCarthy and Marvin. And Marvin said, told me that I should look at what von Neumann did in cellular automata, which was great advice because I'd never heard of cellular automata. But John McCarthy's response was interesting. I said to him, do you think I ought to continue working on this? And he thought about that for a second. Then he said, yes, the world is large enough. It can afford to have one person working on such ideas.
There was one time when I keep telling these stories, and I don't know if I've told you it, but when it was clear that we wanted to build a time-shared big computer, and we went to IBM, asked them if they would support a project to make a time-shared computer. And the head of research asked us to explain what it would do, and the answer was, we'd have a big computer like a 701, and we'd have 20 teletypes, and different people would be typing on them, running their programs, and each time somebody typed a character, the big computer would switch to their program and run a few steps of their program in response to that. And the head of research at IBM said, that's a terrible idea. You say there's 30 people and they're typing at 5 or 10 characters a second. That means you're interrupting the computer 300 times a second. How could it ever get any work done? And we got the machine from Honeywell, wasn't it? Rather than IBM. Or was it GE or Honeywell? I forget.
I think it was GE first, and then
Oh, well.
somehow they sold it to Honeywell or something.
Sometime later, IBM had some pretty good researchers working on artificial intelligence. And Thomas Watson, who was the president of the company, heard about that. And he sent out an order saying, nobody should use any expression like that, because he didn't want the public thinking that IBM was going to make intelligent machines, because they would, the customers would get very upset. And they continued research for a while, but they never used the expression AI again. I don't know if they use it now. Is Watson AI?
They do. I think they just call it deep question answering.
Deep question answering.
Well, the guy who created it was very definite in response to that question, and he said, this is a system to play Jeopardy and nothing else. But later on, IBM's PR people have been touting how smart it was and so on.
Yes, I don't know if it can do any common sense reasoning, but yeah.
So I was, I went to a few talks by Ferrucci, the guy who did the Watson thing, and also I was, I commented the matches, and so online, so I have a career as a sports commentator for this new thing of AI sports. And I don't know, you know, a lot of people asked me, did it have common sense reasoning or did it have AI in it? And I think the answer is that it did, but some, you know, it wasn't the only thing it do. You know, it was kind of a raisin in Patrick Winston's phrase. So one of the people working on the Jeopardy team was Eric Mueller.
Oh.
Who, you know, wrote a textbook on common sense reasoning, among other things. And so I can't believe that there wasn't some influence from him in there. I think the most important thing I think about the architecture of Watson was that it was a society of models. So there's a very nice article in AI Magazine that explains how it was put together. It was using some statistical models. It was using some models that were very stupid that I wouldn't endorse as a way of doing AI. But the idea is that it had a kind of meta architecture that was constantly evaluating them and trying to figure out which ones of them, so it had which ones of the methods work best on which kinds of
So it's using a
problems.
lot of different methods and deciding when to page them in and out?
Yeah, and it had a kind of evaluator. Like, I think one of the things that Eric worked on was if there was a problem involving numbers, then he got that problem, you know. So he probably had some kind of common sense module about numbers. You know, are the numbers little or big, or you know, is this a quantitative problem that I could figure out by looking up a formula? Or, you know, there were probably a few heuristics of that type in it. So I would say it had some AI in it, probably had some common sense knowledge, but that probably wasn't the bulk of it. The most interesting thing about it was the fact that it had this architecture that was constantly trying to figure out which one of the many methods that it, you know, that it was trying to use. I got it, when the thing came out, I got a message from the lab director, Frank Moss, saying, well, wouldn't it be great if they had used your common sense software on Watson? And I said, and in fact, they had asked us to work with them, and I turned them down. And I said to him, so he said, wouldn't it be great if they had used your software? And I said, well, did you hear about the CMU guys who did work with them? And he said, no. And I said, well, there you go.
It's pretty good. Yes, they don't mention that it's a society of mind idea. But
No, Fucci talks about that, actually.
It is on the article as well.
really,
Yeah, he does mention. But not the details, obviously.
well, it'd be interesting. They fired their other group, AI group, the one that Doug Regan.
Just to add to that, I think the class forum, I added the AI magazine that Henry spoke about, and checked with Eric, and a couple of papers are out on the subject. And I think there's a link to all the papers that are out. I think one other thing they did was, I think they do some question analysis where they decompose the question, and that's fed into some hypothesis generation about what possible answers you can get. They feed that answer back into the question, and they create a hypothesis of what to search. So I'd asked one of the people working on it if they used common sense, and I think his answer was not yet, but they do kind of mine the Wikipedia for some kind of data, but that's the closest. So maybe, like Henry said, maybe they use it in a limited context. But there are a lot of like 6, 7 papers in the forum.
Yes, I asked Google a bunch of questions the other day, and it really got the right articles among the first 10 for many of them. I don't remember. I didn't keep a log, but it's getting good at parsing what you said.
Just wondering if you. I was just wondering. Just wondering if you were logged in to your Gmail account at the time, because I know that Google's starting to personalize searches, so you'll see search results based on your previous searches as well. So it might seem a bit more intelligent for that reason as well.
Is that the Google Plus or the regular Google?
I think it's the regular Google as long as you're signed into your account, your Gmail account.
I haven't noticed anything.
I've definitely noticed that it knows what I'm looking for because of that. You could try signing out, and you can see the results are often less relevant.
It certainly says you retrieved this item 5 times before. So it's keeping. I don't know if that record is in Google or in my machine.
It's in Google.
How does the dragon thing work? The dictation.
I'm pretty sure all of the databases that it uses are on your machine. They come with the Dragon software. It's not a cloud service, but I'm not 100% sure. That may have changed since I last used Dragon.
Janet Baker is giving a lecture. What day is it? Friday. It would probably be interesting because she'll explain not only how it works, but how to make a company produce it.
So this is a question about Watson. When it pages all these different methods, is it trying every single one of them at the same time? Or, I'm just trying to clarify that bit.
It has a lot of processors, but I don't know what it's doing. Do you?
Yeah, I don't know to the level of, whether it's trying all these simultaneously. I know that in the offline experiments, they compile cases of, so they play games against humans, they look at records of past games, and to some extent, the trading isn't completely automatic, but to some extent they learn what kinds of techniques work best with what kinds of questions, and so probably they have some upfront classification that I'm sure they don't run every method at every time, because some of these methods are probably pretty consuming. So they probably do some classification of what the kind of, I think the most impressive thing is just, it tries to figure out what kind of question is being asked. And it did a pretty impressive job about that. I don't really know the details of it.
Is their publication complete enough that you can actually see how it works?
You can get the general, they have an article in AI magazine. Sharad said there might be others. I've just read that one article so far.
They've drawn out the architecture. Even in the article that you mentioned, they actually have a picture of the flow of what's happening, how the question comes in, how it's broken down. The publications, they start giving you an idea of the algorithms that they use, but not the full picture.
Certainly would be nice if one could see the whole thing and even experiment with it.
This question is about which comes first, the machinery or the common sense. I know once we built it, we can, for the sake of reasoning and intelligence, we could feed it this database of common sense and the rules that come with it. But was part of the machinery built because there was common sense? So this is going back, thousands of years or millions of years, whenever. In that context, whatever we would call common sense, for the Neanderthal period, for example, was the machinery in their brain probably built because of that, or did that happen first, and as a software we started working on building common sense?
We don't have much record of that, what happened in that 5 million years, since we were gorillas or chimpanzees or whatever. Have you heard of finger monkeys? Maybe I'll I don't know if I can find it. But they're about as big, they're little lemurs about as big as your thumb. And they smile.
Are you sure this is a real thing?
I wondered. We'll put it on some web page. So we come from those primates, and we don't know anything about their mental development. And since the humans split off from the pretty much about the same time that the chimpanzees and orangutans diverged. It's about 5 million years ago. So there's a few paintings in caves, but I believe those are all tens of thousands of years. Are there any human habitats of 1 million years ago? What's the oldest ones?
The oldest artifacts?
Yeah,
75,000 years.
it's not much.
Drilled seashells, presumably used as jewelry.
Ah. Well, you could use it for scraping things. Probably rather useful gadgets.
Conventional wisdom is we've only been anatomically modern for about 200,000 years.
Yes, I'm curious as to when dogs appeared, because as soon as you got dogs, then you could normally, to survive in the jungle, you have to have your nose near the ground, because that's the way to detect bad things. But once we had dogs, then people could have the dogs look for the dangers, and then the people could stand up. So I'd like to know when the dogs got domesticated. Or maybe there was some other animal that wasn't dogs that served this function. Or maybe it was older people who were ordered to crawl around. And presumably older people were 30 or 40 years old. I think one remarkable thing is that humans live almost twice as long as any other primate. So it could be that for most animals, not all, but for most animals, only the parent generation is around. But it could be that humans had a great advantage in having grandparents who were still around frequently, which means that the middle generation could do other things than take care of the children. So it would be interesting to, because chimpanzees and gorillas live about twice as long as all the other primates, and humans live about, so they get to be about 30 or 40, and humans get to be about 60 or 80. So this probably has some meaning having to do with selection and survival. Yeah.
So I want to know if you know, like, how many projects there are out there, like, trying to do an intelligence system. How many people, and like, if you believe that what's lacking is the right theory to be put in practice, or just lines of code to be written and the theory is already out there?
That's a great question. We ought to have a map. Has anybody compiled a... Heikki, you know what's happening in Europe in that area?
I know some, but I don't know if there is many people doing ambitious efforts. By the way, I just looked up on the CNN site at the quite early in the lecture. You mentioned that it would be nice to have this 1 billion investment for developing AI to take care of elderly people. So now I just looked up on a CNN website how much Watson cost, and the estimate is $1 to $2 billion. So they spent $1 to $2 billion developing that.
Billion?
Yes, program.
To develop Watson?
That's impossible.
So
They must be,
I
they
think
must be
this is.
counting all of computation since the beginning of time.
IBM has a large budget.
So apparently IBM has a $6 billion research budget every year, and they put 5 to 10% of that directly or indirectly. And that's how this is calculated. So I don't know the details. I haven't heard of IBM.
Wow.
It's more like 100 million.
Why? It's not 1 billion.
30 people or something for a few years.
Yeah. So this is that's the official estimate, and then
Which
there's
is-
another that says
Which is
1
a bargain
billion.
because it's only about 10 Super Bowl ads.
How long is a Super Bowl ad? Is it a minute?
30 seconds. Yeah.
30 seconds. So they got a lot more publicity out of that than they would have got out of the 10 Super Bowl ads.
Yeah, it's a bargain.
Yeah, I was wondering what's the world cost of sports?
Direct or indirect?
Direct, I think, would be interesting enough.
Well, there it goes.
Well, if you paid people $1 an hour to watch sports, how much would it cost?
But then again, it's probably quite cheap. If the people weren't watching sports but were instead killing each other or having stuff like that, then that might be more expensive by human capital.
What would they do? They would invent sports. There must be some country that doesn't.
Yeah, just for comparison, the Coca-Cola's annual advertising budget is $1.6 billion.
What's their profit? Does it?
I don't know, we could find out.
At the Media Lab meeting, there were yet smaller Coke bottles. 7 ounces. Both. But there's what?
Oh, they were red.
They're red. They look like Coke cans, but they're 7-ounce size.
So NSF's budget was $7.7 billion.
Oh, that's more than I thought.
So whatever happened to massive parallelism? It used to be in the business.
Well, I think the Watson is, how many processors does it claim to use?
I don't know, a couple thousand.
It's
It has
getting
16 terabytes of RAM, and each processor can only index, 64 gigabytes, so that's at least hundreds of processors.
There are a lot of interesting problems that can't be solved with parallelism. So if you put, to depends on the geometry of your search trees. So if a process is going to require a great many steps, then parallelism is hard to sequential steps, then parallelism can't help much. But I don't know what's happened. Every now and then you see an announcement that somebody in some country has the biggest computer at the moment, and it's usually a few hundred or thousand processors that they got somewhere else. So I haven't heard of any attempt to make a really colossal machine. Neil Gershenfeld had a project here in which he hoped to make an extremely efficient and inexpensive super parallel computer. It turned out that it was hard to do some kinds of operations like recursion in that architecture, but does anybody know what's happened lately? Is that project still going?
It is not.
Just stopped. David was a vital part of it, so he someday he'll tell the story.
So the whole Rolla machine project is stopped?
Yes, I think everyone involved has acknowledged at this point that it's not very efficient.
But the demos were really pretty. Yes, it would be nice to know what the brain does and how parallel it is. And I won't repeat my complaints about neuroscientists, but generally we don't see architectural theories of what the brain centers do, except in the beautiful cases of the cerebellum, which is maybe fairly well understood, and the visual cortex, which is fairly well understood, at least at the first stages. But there aren't any theories, I've never seen any good theories of how different brain centers communicate. We know that there are these bundles of wires, but we don't know if they're like K-lines or Zato coding or whatever. And I'm afraid most of the papers I read go the other direction and say there's much more in the glial cells that support the neurons than anybody ever suspected, and that's sort of mystical. It's like saying that the paint on the car is the important part.
Well, in your book, you mentioned that the higher level processes are more likely to be, sequential, not parallel, because it takes a lot of resources to build them and to support them. I found that also when you're trying to fall asleep, if you activate your higher level resources, like say from like self-reflective and up, if you started like reflecting, it's almost impossible to fall asleep. It's almost like you're only able to fall asleep when those are like resting and your lower level processes are the only ones that
You can't fall asleep when you're reflecting?
Yeah.
But
Feynman says the opposite, right? He had the whole entire stage in his life where he sort of reflected as he was going to sleep and was able to sort of control his dreams.
Well, there are people, what do you call controlled dreaming?
Lucid dreaming.
What's the word?
Lucid.
Lucid dreaming, where you can program yourself for a particular topic. How many of you can do that? 1, 2, 3? It would be boring to have the same dream every time. So.
I mean, like recognizing what kind of thinking is going on in yourself, or trying to recognize.
Well, a good question is how much of dreaming is thinking, and how different is it from regular thinking? Is it just that you've turned some critics off, or I don't think neuroscientists have critics, though, yet.
You know John Cox's theory of dreams?
No.
Okay. John Cox's theory of dreams goes like this. If you imagine that we have an optimal encoder that stores things away by, optimally encoding it. Okay, well, then you have to have the decoder. But if it's an optimal encoder, then any random noise
Makes
would
sense.
decode into a plausible sequence of events.
Right.
And if you happen to hear a barking dog while you're asleep, that fact can be incorporated into the dream by that same mechanism with the optimal decoding. So something I received over on a phone call once a long time ago.
So if you were in an anechoic chamber, maybe you would not have such good dreams, because you wouldn't get any external signals.
You don't need them.
Right.
Well, your brain can probably make quite a lot of noise that will. So I don't think you need to have somatic signals to have that kind of.
You don't need that. The only point is it can be incorporated into a dream, and that does happen when you're dreaming and there's some particular sound like a fire engine going by. It does get incorporated into your dream, at least in my case. But so his mechanism explains that.
John Cock was a friend of ours who was a first-rate mathematician who worked at IBM.
He was a great computer architect, and he designed the PowerPC series of CPUs, so on. Invented RISC architecture.
And improved my theorem on tag. I published a paper with him.
The projector isn't on right now, so you know.
I don't have anything new to say. It usually shuts off at 8:30.
Went 8:15.
8:15? Oh.
That's the program audio we just muted.
He didn't notice it.
While the projector's going up, I have a question. Do you think it's necessary for intelligent beings to sleep? And if so, do you think future AI will be required to sleep?
That's a great question, because I don't think anyone really understands why sleep is necessary. So it's I mean, maybe it's to empty buffers that have gotten stuck. You can make up computer-like theories, but I don't think I've never heard of any theory that comes along with some evidence. Do you have a?
They say it's good for memory, no? So yeah, maybe when you create your K lines, when you're seeing stuff, you create your K lines and it's not the optimal way, or I don't know.
Oh, the standard theory is that REM sleep is necessary to transfer records into long-term memory from short-term memory. I don't know if anyone has a theory of how that works, though. So it's how do you decide? How do you route a representation of knowledge from the hippocampus or wherever, or the amygdala or wherever it's stored in short-term memory? I think it's the amygdala, supposedly. And how does it find a place in the larger brain, and what representation does it have, and so forth? I've never seen any, I don't read that literature much, but I don't know of any popular theory of how knowledge is represented in short-term memory and later in long-term, and how it's transferred and what the locations are and what determines them. Any of you had any contact with that side of neuroscience? Yeah.
I guess one standard computer analogy for dreaming is garbage collection. So, you can talk about copying garbage collection, and so you could imagine it's some kind of copying garbage collection.
Yes. When do animals start sleeping? Do crocodiles sleep? We could ask Google. What do they dream about?
Well, porpoises are interesting.
They
sleep half their brain at a time.
Right. Porpoises and albatrosses.
They would drown.
Have you ever seen an albatross take off? Usually takes 4 tries. It falls over, and it's lucky.
Android's dream of electric sheep.
It's lucky it doesn't break its neck when it runs as fast as it can and falls over.
Wasn't that the story that became Blade Runner?
Oh.
Android's Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, right?
Yes. Did they sleep? In
the replicants?
Yeah. It came back.
Minsky? Maybe.
There must be something in chapter 5
That has to do with dreams.
That's interesting. How far back do you have to go before that looks like?
No.
What?
I'm teasing.
I wouldn't recognize it either.
Up there you go.
It really looked like when I swung my monitor past it, but looking at my eyes doesn't do the same thing.
Oh. Can Google recognize faces yet?
Facebook.
It can search based on images. So you can upload an image and say, find an image like this one. And I think it just does it by color selection, shapes, and general thing.
And if they say if they used face recognition technology, they would be in danger of violating all sorts of laws. So they make sure that whatever they do, it's officially not face recognition.
Marvin, there's another question. Neuroscience now, they have like some sort of approach or tools that can, I believe they can recognize like the waves, like the electromagnetic waves in your brains. Do you think we need more powerful tools, or it's just that they're not asking the right questions
And yeah, that's the question. Like, because you said that the neurons just like transmit, I don't know, like certain voltage, and maybe what we just need to study is like these patterns of like these wave signals that we send between neurons, and it doesn't seem that hard, like to detect that.
Marvin, you turn your microphone off.
Did I turn it off?
It's in your pocket.
That's amazing. How could it change the switch in my pocket? All of the current scanning instruments are very low resolution. So if you had something like, if one of those white matter bundles going from one part of the brain to another has 10,000 signals, you can't resolve any of those. So there might be lots of bits going along one of these fiber bundles, and all you can see in the with the brain scanning techniques is a change in metabolism of a fairly large pixel. You're not seeing the signals themselves. You're seeing the average of thousands of signals. So it's going to be very hard until you actually stick a lot of needles in one of those pathways. And probably somebody will be able to invent some not very dangerous way of doing that, but there aren't any now. They put fairly high resolution things on the surface of the cortex, and that way you can get a lot of information, but not through the skull. Anyway.
So I think what the also was, and I'd be also interested to hear if you believe that more advanced or more detailed images of the, well, I call it implementation of how the mind is implemented in our brains or the actual data, how helpful this would be in the discovering the actual cognitive functions or brain center operation or whatever.
Well, it's a very hard...
No, too little to answer that question.
It's just very hard to see how you could get thousands of electrical signals out. But for example, there's the big channel between the speech recognition area and the speech production area. I forget what it's called. It would be wonderful to know what's happening on those many thousands of fibers, and then you could probably discover how words or syntactic structures are represented if you could just see what's actually happening on those neurons. Somebody will invent some three-dimensional scanner someday, but right now it takes too much energy and would ruin everything.
So I recently read a report online about a study done at UC Berkeley. I don't know if you've heard of it, but the idea is that they supposedly found a way to make like scans of brainwaves and visualize it using like fMRI software. I think the idea was that certain brainwaves could be associated with like certain images,
Associated with what?
Certain brain waves would be associated with certain shapes. And I think I actually have the report right in front of me, but basically they showed test subjects like two different, I think it was like hour-long YouTube videos.
Oh.
And they had like, on this website they showed like the YouTube video that the test subject was shown, and sort of the simulated like image that was derived from the brainwaves of the particular subject. And
is that an image of what the patient is looking at the moment, or is it one that he's thinking about?
It seemed to be a combination of both, because when I looked at the video, like for just generic shapes, it would match up pretty easily. But when there was like a profile of when it was zooming in on someone's profile, the image was very difficult to sort of render. I can show you the link if you want to take a look at it.
Well, if you take off a piece of skull and look at the primary visual cortex, which is called Area 17 for no particular reason. Then, if you're operating on an epileptic patient or something, like someone like that, then while you're doing the operation, you can put an array of a lot of electrodes, say 20 by 20 array or even more. And in the primary visual cortex, you can get an image, because this piece of cortex goes right to the optic nerve and gets signals from the back of the eye. So you can, but in a sense that doesn't tell you much, because you know that the image has to get inside the head somehow. And the real question is more what's happening in the next two areas, 18 and 19, which are do all sorts of processing, but you can't get an image from them, or at least as far as I know, nobody has. Also, these images are being dated at about 10 per second, so you get movies, which is nice, from the primary cortex.
I mean, do you think it would be possible to like look at brainwaves and try to determine what, if you record someone's brainwaves while they're dreaming, do you think it would be possible to determine what they're dreaming about?
Well, brainwave is a specific term for a very large-scale event.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not much information in that. But if you could see the electrical activity in the brain, then you could. In other words, when the phrase brainwave stands for alpha, beta, and there's about 4 different types of waves, and those are very unlocalized. The reason they're interesting is that you can pick them up with an audio amplifier, I think, because they are resulting from firing of very large numbers of neurons, and so you get millivolts rather than microvolts, and it's easy to pick up outside the skull. But picking up the signals from large numbers of individual nerve cells has never really been feasible. And maybe it won't be so hard. In a few years, maybe you can make a little integrated circuit that has little synthesizing modules that make the tiny silver wires or carbon fibers that go down into the brain and go around obstacles a little bit. And There's no reason why you couldn't have fibers of the order of a micron in size, thousandth of a millimeter, that could pick up very large numbers of signals without damaging the brain too much. But I guess people working on nanotechnology are getting close to considering such things because they...
Gordon is actually building something very much like that. I think that...
Is there any gadget that can make a carbon fiber under controlled conditions?
Not really. It's not carbon. You're not at the limiting point where you need nanotubes. I mean, he's building fibers of more like 10 micron diameter, which you can make using sort of conventional technologies, almost like MEMS.
So it's not down to the 1 micron level yet, but there's at least a few groups that are definitely thinking about how to get very large numbers of signals out of the brain by using thin fibers that go around obstacles a little bit.
Well, if you could get a large number, it might not matter much where they're from because
that's the idea.
Nobody's ever seen any brain center working in great detail.
Right. But you probably still wouldn't be able to get them close enough together to see any two neurons that are directly connected to each other.
Also,
So
you could put
that'll still have
signals
to
in
wait.
and learn a lot.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
I have my own prejudice about this, but I think a lot of the interest in the brain is a lot like interest in how birds fly with regard to designing airplanes or inventing airplanes. So in inventing an airplane, the bird was a kind, especially a soaring bird, like a hawk, was a good thing to look at a little bit, but then studying the feathers and laying of eggs. If we had copied them, then a Boeing 747 after a while would lay this egg and out would hatch another one, which you'd have to feed something, I don't know what. But it's the high-level principles we really need from the brain, not the low-level implementation.
Now, what do you consider to be low level?
What
do you consider low level?
What I consider, well, it's like where do all these neurons go and how are they interconnected and so on. If you looked at the back panel of a Cray computer, they had, it looked like a totally random wiring diagram. Every wire went someplace sort of at random and it appeared. However, if you looked at that and then designed a computer by having all the wires going at random, it wouldn't compute, of course. So I just think that there's some high-level principles at work in the brain that we got to figure out, but the low-level wiring, I think, is kind of besides the point because it's pretty clear to me that however much signal processing goes on in the brain, one chip today can probably outdo it by a factor of 1,000, in my opinion. Especially with something called CUDA. And this is a new thing. It turns out in your computer, for the display, there's a bunch of GPUs. A GPU is a graphic processing unit that's pretty powerful. And it turns out, like I looked at my laptop, I discovered there were like 380 CUDA processors in the display chip. And there were 2 display chips in my laptop. And there's now software that lets you compute with those in general. And you can do amazing things on occasion.
So if you could send stuff to your visual cortex, you might be able to compute something useful instead of just seeing stuff.
Patrick, I think that's the way you hypothesize a lot of thinking happens, right? It's all through visual.
I think I disagree with that a little bit. I think what happens to a neuron doesn't matter much, but what happens to a bundle of neurons matters a lot. And I think what's largely broken about the last 50 years in computer vision is that it has not been recognized that the visual system has, for every bundle of wires going in one direction, an equally big one going the other way. And so when I look at that picture of Lincoln, I think that one way of thinking about what must be happening is that when you squint, you finally get to a point where there's no reason to believe it isn't Lincoln. And the only reason you don't say Lincoln right away is because when you see those blocks, there is a reason to believe it's not Lincoln. So I think a lot of it is top-down hallucination. It's guided by a little bit by what comes in through your retina, but for the most part, it isn't. So that's a guess based on the fact that half our brain is devoted to vision, and everything goes in every direction. And it seems to me that that's an important fact. I guess I would also speculate that a lot of what we call common sense is a consequence of reusing that apparatus. My favorite example is imagine what it would be like to run out of this room carrying a full bucket of water. We all know your leg would get wet, but nobody ever told us that. We've never seen it done. It's probably not available as a fact on Google, but we certainly know it, and we know it, I think, because we can imagine it and reuse our perceptual apparatus to figure out what's going to happen. So that's sort of just-in-time common sense, and once we've imagined it once, we can cache it. So I don't think, in the end, there's a need to have a whole lot of common sense to start with, because we can build up that library as we need it. So, Mark, what do you think? Do you think that much of common sense is a consequence of... Do you think that much of common sense can be accounted for by imagining situations and figuring it out on the fly? Perhaps reusing our perceptual apparatus? If so, then Watson doesn't have a chance because it doesn't have perceptual apparatus or any imagination.
Well, you're certainly using all sorts of... I mean, when I think of doing this, I can hear it clinking just before I get there. So it's not just vision, but I wonder, when are children able to visualize complicated mechanical situations? There's this phenomenon where children of age 2 can count to 2, and children who are 3-year-olds can count to 3, and then 4-year-olds can count to 10. But it's interesting how long it takes to get from 3 to higher.
Interesting experiment. They count up on their fingers to add 2 and 2 to 4. I wonder if they can imagine that without actually looking at their fingers.
I had a little essay in a book on logo complaining that if you look in a child's world, it's very hard to find 3 of anything. There's lots of 2s because of symmetry, and you have 2 hands and 2 feet and stuff, and if you're lucky, 2 parents. But if you walk around the house, which I did, I couldn't find 3 of anything that a child might consider to be significant enough to form a concept for 3-ness.
How about 5?
Well, you can't get there. Apparently, once you get to 4, the rest is easy. But why is it a whole year between 2 and 3? And so a great experiment, which would only cost $1 billion, would be to provide 1 million children, 2-year-olds, with toys that have 3 parts or something, and see if they learn to count to 3 slightly sooner.
So this discussion made me think about the concept of embodied cognition, which is the idea that because human beings are born into a 3-dimensional world and are born with a body and with all the, I guess, everything that's associated with having a body and embodying having a body and living in this spatial existence, a lot of our mental structures sort of take advantage of these things. As in, a lot of the way that we think about things utilize space to organize our thoughts and utilize the fact that we have bodies to help us think. So I guess this made me sort of think about, like, in order to make computers that think like humans, will we have to fake them, make computers think that they have human bodies, perhaps?
Well, you could give them a little simulator. I think you do just as well with stick figures than with three-dimensional. That's 2.5 dimensional, sort of. But I don't know if that idea of embodied cognition actually holds up anymore. It was popular for a while because of, actually it was an MIT professor, Dick Held, who, I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. He did some experiments which showed that if you carry an animal around, it can't find its way back in general. But if you drag it around on a leash or something, then it can. And so he concluded that people couldn't do motor learning unless they had actively engaged the environment. But then we got reason to think that this didn't apply to humans because of that PhD thesis of Jose, what's his name? Valenti. He had a cerebral palsy patient who had never moved around in the real world, was sort of bedridden. But he observed stuff, and when he was given the controls of a logo turtle, he was able to, he didn't have any trouble when the turtle turned around to make it turn left instead of right because it was facing the other way, which was the kind of thing that Held had shown that that his lab animals couldn't learn. So so the idea of embodied cognition became very popular, and it was wide. Now it lit up. How do you keep your hand out of your pocket?
We need it out now.
So while Marvin's battery is getting recharged there, I think the problem with Brooks is that he observed that people are smart and people have bodies, therefore we better have bodies if we're going to be smart. And that might be sort of true at a certain level, but it's only true in the sense that maybe it's the perceptual apparatus that's important. But just presuming that there's something religious about having a body seems to me to be wrong-headed, because the natural tendency is to go off and spend several years soldering up a robot, thinking that you're contributing to intelligence. So it's a little bit like Ed's feather example. It's not important to have feathers, but it can be useful to know how feathers work and how they're hollow and all that stuff to reduce weight. So the real question is, what does having a body actually do for you? Not to go off and suppose that there's something mystically and religiously sacred about having a body.
Yeah, there's no reason why a machine couldn't have a simulated world. And
in fact, we do. We imagine stuff all the time.
Yeah. The question is, do 1-year-olds do that? Who knows? Probably they do.
One last question.
Well, as soon as they start playing, which is like 2 or 3, they can imagine everything. All over the place.
So when we are imagining stuff, we don't usually imagine the smell of things. And so the smell of things, and like, I don't know, it's important that we use our apparatus, and like, maybe our imagination is constrained by like how much area we use. It's constrained, but like cats, I don't know what's the point that I'm trying to make, but cats, like, cats have a really good representation of smell, and dogs have. And maybe like why they can't find a path is because their vision apparatus, like in their brain, like the part that represents the vision, is not very well developed as for humans. Because when we imagine stuff, we use more the vision than like smelling or, I don't know, touching. Like dreams are not, you don't feel touching too much. You imagine with your eyes, with your vision, more than smelling and touching. And maybe why we are so good is because we concentrate more in vision than smelling or touching or, I don't know, any other.
Well, that embodied cognition issue is a strange one because, because some people feel very strongly about it, and I'm not sure what the psychology of those psychologists is. Anyway, it looks like it's time to go. We could ask Google if it's still raining. You don't need a body anymore with Google.